IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Takshashila Institution's All Things Policy. I'm your host for today, Jaison, and I hope you've been having a wonderful week because today we're going to talk about a very interesting report that was published recently by the Koan Advisory Group, which is a New Delhi-based public policy consultancy that specializes in policy and regulatory analysis in both traditional and emergent sectors and markets. So I've got with me Tamanna Sharma. Tamanna, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Pal. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So we're going to speak to Tamanna on one of the reports that was published, she and her colleagues, on the effectiveness of tobacco disclaimers on OTT content services. So we'll just go over the findings of this particular study that they have done. I must also acknowledge that this was in collaboration with their survey partner, Youth Ki Awaaz. So yeah, interested to sort of delve into the major findings from the study. But Tamanna, if we can maybe just take a step back and if you can maybe share with our listeners on what exactly was the thinking behind broaching this particular issue, right? Because there was, a sort of statement from the Ministry of Health and Family Affairs which sort of triggered this particular issue to come back into the spotlight. So could you just give us a background of what the issue is at hand and the motivations behind sort of conducting this survey?
Sure. So, Carl, even before the ministry issued this statement, this has been going on for a couple of years now. So really ever since OTT, has gained popularity and it's become one additional option of content consumption. So, for example, a lot of reports came out, especially in the past 2 years, which were calling the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to sort of extend the ambit of COTPA to include online content curated platforms, OCCPs, which I'll, for the sake of, everyone's ease, I'll refer to OTT platforms here. And again, as I mentioned, there have been several reports. And so we had been following this issue for quite some time. We reviewed those reports and we tried to see what these different people are saying and what is the issue at hand. And I'll take you maybe I'll talk a little bit about tobacco depiction regulation in general, just to give an idea of how this whole thing has started. So, it has a long history. It started in 2005, where the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare said that tobacco depiction in films and television programs, any sort of depiction of tobacco products was banned. And this was done all the way back in 2005. Now, a couple of interesting things here. First, this notification in 2005 came without consulting the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And second, this was done without consulting the industry. So a lot of pushback was received on this ban. So let me just give you one example. For example, Mahesh Bhatt was somebody who really voiced concern about how the implementation of this ban would go about and how it would impact, international content, movies coming from outside the country. And so this is really how the whole regulation of tobacco depiction started. That ban was lifted in 2011, where there were some subsequent changes in 2012. These are called the film rules. And that point is what essentially started the whole 30-second health scroll that we see now in movies. Whenever you go to a theater, you see that 30-second Mukesh video. That's essentially the regulation that was brought in 2011 and 12. So that's the background. And from there, we have now come to, let's include OCCPs in this regulation because there's tobacco depiction on OCCPs. So what we really recognized was two things. First, there has been no direct investigation of the impact of tobacco consumption and its depiction on OTT platforms. Because as I said, OTT is something that's gained popularity very recently in the past couple of years. So no one really till date had studied this relationship directly. And the second and the most important thing is that a lot of these regulations and a lot of these calls for regulating OCCPs lacked consumer feedback. And ultimately, when you're trying to bring in regulation for the benefit of the consumer and you don't take their challenges and perspectives into account, then there's definitely going to be an issue in implementation, right? Especially these kind of regulations, like regulation of digital media in general, a lot of the times it is targeted towards the younger populations, right?
Yep.
Because as a lot of people have said, catch them young. So if you're bringing in regulation, but you are not talking to the relevant people, so the consumers who will directly get affected by this regulation, then there's obviously going to be an issue. So, that's really where we came in. We wanted to bring in the consumer perspective, which is why we conducted this survey, and we felt that it was needed and there was definitely a gap in the existing literature.
Got it. No, that's great, Tamanna, to sort of set the context for the conversation. In fact, I've had a look at the report as well, and it was interesting to see that you had about 1,900 survey participants, right? So, which gives you, can you just give us a sense of the sample and the demographics of these OTT viewers?
Yeah. So this survey was firstly conducted online. So we reached out to people through electronic medium and we covered about 2,800 people. And our sample was reduced to about 1,900 because we specifically focused on people who watch OTT content. So firstly, we filtered people who do not watch OTT content. So like out of the 2,800, about 33% said that no, we have not seen OTT content in the past 3 months. So they were filtered out. So that's how we got to the 1,896 sample size. And out of these, about majority of them were men in the age group of 18 to 35, I'd say roughly. So about 86% were men in the survey and about 10% women, and the rest was unspecified or non-binary. And out of the respondents, about 25% were smokers and the rest were non-smokers or they did not want to specify.
Got it. So I think, and since we are expecting to know the sort of repercussions of this particular move, both from on the OTT side and also consumer perspective, and your survey, in fact, serves to capture the sentiments of, both these sort of stakeholders. Can you just give me a sense of what was the government's policy objective from doing this, right, in the first place? Like, is it health reasons primarily, or is there some, larger policy objective that they would like to achieve? So if you could maybe start off by sharing the government's view on this, and then followed by maybe the study findings that you and your team came up.
Sure. I don't know if I'd be the best person to comment on what the government's view was. From our understanding, it came from the point of view of, increased tobacco consumption and the worry that, more and more people are consuming tobacco. So how should we go about taking effective measures? And that's a pretty good, that is something that the government definitely should be concerned about as well as. So, again, I really can't comment on what their perspective was. It seems like the issue is curbing tobacco consumption. But I'd just like to point out that this issue government has already addressed through the IT rules 2021. If you look at the IT rules, they specifically say that scenes on OTT content that depict tobacco or smoking scenes, they automatically receive a higher age rating classification. So you have these different age ratings, UA 7, UA 13 plus. So the IT rules already mandate that you have to give a higher age rating to these type of content. So it's slightly confusing because the regulation is already there. So the idea was to see why the additional regulation, why the additional disclaimers, essentially, right? And so that's really where our study and survey sort of comes in. And our focus as well was trying to assess the need for these additional disclaimers, not really questioning the existence of tobacco warnings.
Got it.
Because obviously that's an important issue to address.
Yeah.
So let me just go on to some of the findings now, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, we wanted to assess, are people aware of the existing mandates that are there under the IT rules? So we questioned our respondents of their awareness of existing age ratings and content descriptors. And we found that majority of them, so 2 out of every 3 respondents in our survey, that yes, we are aware of the existing age ratings and the content descriptors that are displayed on OTT content. So that's a very positive sign that there's a high amount of awareness in OTT viewers in India, right? Second, we wanted to assess how watching certain content on OTT would impact their smoking behavior. So again, what we found was that 2 out of every 3 respondents said that depiction of smoking on OTT is not going to affect their smoking behavior, right? And it's not very surprising. Again, as I said, there has been no direct study of this relationship. And even if we look at existing studies that, for example, try and assess the impact of theater on alcohol consumption or films on alcohol consumption, even those studies have largely remained inconclusive. So there is no evidence to say that, oh, watching certain kind of content is going to affect your smoking behavior. So that's number 2. And third, we try to assess what are certain factors that would maybe prompt a person to, start smoking. So we asked the respondents and we gave them a couple of options that these are the following factors, and how do you feel these would affect you to start smoking? Now, what we found that depiction of smoking on TV and OTT does not have any impact on a person's smoking initiation habit, right? What we found was that it's actually factors like influence of peers, friends, as well as mental stress that encourage a person to uptake smoking. And on the other hand, family, neighborhood, and ads at point of sale sort of act as deterrents. So they discourage a person from the uptake of smoking. And I think these results largely make sense. I mean, even if you think in layman terms, like friends, family, and given that, especially because of COVID, because there was a lot of isolation and a lot of people had to forcefully be isolated, that definitely added a lot of stress to people's lives. And it may have, led to some behavioral changes. And we have mentioned in our report that there are studies that show that forced isolation sort of can lead to a person's behavioral change in a negative way. It can actually lead to them, like starting smoking. Yeah. So these are the 3 key points in terms of OTT's depiction of tobacco, smoking, and a person's behavior related to smoking. Yes. And lastly, what we tried to say was, do people feel the need for these additional warnings? So one thing is we asked, how would these additional warnings impact your viewing experience? So, and this is a very important point to note here. When you compare television and theater with OTT, most people now watch OTT content on their smartphones. Even in our survey, about 75 to 80% said that, yes, we watch OTT content on our smartphones. Smartphones are what? They are 5 to 7 inches in size.
Yeah, so, 5, 6, 7 inches. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Now, comparing this to a large smart TV or an even bigger theater screen, you have to recognize that there's a difference in the way people are consuming these medias, right? So 53% respondents in our survey said that yes, if you introduce additional warnings, it will negatively impact our viewing experience because obviously we are watching on a small screen. If there are subtitles, then on top of that, you're introducing warnings. It's definitely going to take a majority of the screen and the person is for sure going to get distracted by it, right? The second thing is very simply just 52% respondents said that, yeah, we question the need for these additional disclaimers because there are existing age ratings and content descriptors already in place on OTT content. So we don't really feel the need for these additional disclaimers. So, broadly speaking, these are sort of the key findings that emerged from our survey. And yeah, I think they're largely aligned with what you would expect any, young population to respond. So, yeah.
It was very, very interesting. In fact, what we'll do is we'll link the report, on our show notes for this episode. So you all can take a look and I strongly recommend. It's fairly comprehensive and I really like the questions that your team has put together, which seems to capture a wide array of potential concerns that from a consumer standpoint is important to look at. So what we'll do, Tamanna, we'll take a quick sort of break and we'll come back and maybe you can share a few potential policy recommendations from the study that you can glean from. So yeah, we'll be back, listeners. Stay tuned. Hello, and we are back discussing the report on the effectiveness of tobacco disclaimers on OTT content viewing. So we've got Tamanna here who in just before the break, gave us a sense of the findings from the study, especially keeping in mind the consumer perspective on this very pertinent issue. So Tamanna, now just coming to what could be some of the responses for the industry, right, which are led by these OTT platforms. So what are some of their recommendations on this? And also from the point of view of the study that you conducted, are there any other recommendations that you think the government could take on board?
So, Carl, in our study and while we were conducting this research, we really tried to think from our perspective what could be some alternate strategies. And there are two key things that we feel would be feasible for OCCPs to consider. So, first is that strengthening the enforcement of the existing IT rules. Now, it's important to recognize that standards are only as effective as their enforcement. And successful standards require them to be implemented across the industry. Now, what I mean by this is there are currently some 50 OTT services registered on MIV's website, but not all of them are associated with existing SRBs. SRBs are self-regulatory bodies. These are bodies which OTT platforms can join, and they essentially are bodies who respond to, regulatory measures, and it's a way for them to self-regulate, essentially. So what we found that not all OTT platforms are actually part of the existing SRBs. We currently only have two SRBs. One is with the IMAI. It's called the Digital Publishers Content Grievances Council. And the second is with the IBDF. It's called the Digital Media Content Regulatory Council. So it's important to ensure that, all OTT content services operating in the country are affiliated with either of these two existing SRBs to ensure that, there's a uniform user experience across different OCCPs. Because as I mentioned, the IT rules already have existing age ratings and content descriptors. And the OTT platforms who are part of these SRBs will have to make sure that they are, abiding by these guidelines. So it's important that all OTTs make sure that they're part of these SRBs. That's really number one. And the number two thing is the key issue being discussed here is the age appropriateness of content, right? So if you want to make sure that there's age appropriateness and younger audiences are not exposed to content that is not age appropriate for them, then you need to ensure a high standard of age gating and age verification. And that's really is, moving beyond the minimal level of compliance. I mean, you could implement an age verification method that's a self-ticking box, but is it really effective? That's a question mark, I would say. So in our report, we have tried to look at a cross-section of different countries who are using these methods to maintain age appropriateness of online content. So for example, UK's Ofcom is one entity that said that self-ticking mechanisms are not very effective. And what they have instead tried to say is that use automatic tools that can verify whether the person sitting on that system is 18 years or older. Or you use some sort of access systems that have some technical tools that can be used for age verification. And this is feasible for OCCPs to do because this is technology-driven platforms, right? Unlike television and theater, where you can't really use technology to verify a person's age, OCCPs can go this route, and they definitely should. Obviously, I have to bring in a caveat that such measures have to make sure that an individual's privacy and personal data and security are not compromised. And there are definitely ways to address that issue as well. So, yeah, I mean, it really comes down to these two basic things we feel that, you have to standardize, implementation of existing mandates across the industry. And you have to ensure high standards of age verification.
No, absolutely. And, this report does go a long way in capturing the consumer sort of feedback and inputs, which hopefully would be taken cognizance by the ministry. Tamanna, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful chat to have with you. And I strongly encourage our listeners to sort of have a read through the report, which we link to the show notes, as I mentioned earlier. So thanks for joining us, Tamanna, and hope to have you and maybe your colleagues as well in our show going forward.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.